Okay, so we'll continue discussing descriptions of the wallpaper, and as we read along, we know that the protagonist's feelings towards the wallpaper transform and change, evolve over the course of the story. At first, she finds it repulsive, revolting, repellent, and she refers to the yellow as a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the sun or moonlight. It starts looking differently, and it has a sickly sulfur tint in others. So we can start thinking about the color and the significance of the color. There's no real right or wrong answer for this, but yellow maybe has a connotation, certain kinds of yellow, of being sort of sickly, unhealthy, unclean. So the descriptions of the wallpaper and the patterns that exist on it, they change, or she starts seeing things in them, and over the course of the story what she sees will change. I always have a hard time sort of visualizing the wallpaper because of the descriptions in it are so vivid that you almost want to see it for yourself, which is one of the neat things that the story does, makes you visualize what it might look like. So on the bottom of page 76, there's a description of the paper. So this paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. There was a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck, and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. And then further down, I never saw so much expression in an inanimate thing before. So there's this description, and it almost seems as if she talks about the paper as if it was almost a living entity, right? It has so much expression. She describes it in a sort of human-like way, so she's sort of anthropomorphizing it, humanizing it. So it has eyes and a broken neck, it looks like. So perhaps that's a foreshadow of some sort of possible suicide, maybe even in the story. There's some sort of hints that that's possibly what will happen to her character, even though that's not what happens. It's sort of just implied by her breakdown. And then page 77, near the bottom there's another description. So she describes, this wallpaper has a kind of sub-pattern in a different shade, a particularly irritating one, for you can only see it in certain lights, and not clearly then. But in the places where it isn't faded and where the sun is just so, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to skulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design. So she starts seeing a pattern emerging, and there's sort of layers to the pattern. And she starts again, it becomes more and more a human-like figure, a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure who seems to skulk behind the front pattern. And then eventually, first she was revolted and disgusted by it, but then it starts fascinating her. So 78, she says, I'm getting really fond of the room in spite of the wallpaper, perhaps because of the wallpaper. It dwells in my mind so. So she becomes fascinated and obsessed even by the wallpaper, and it's pretty much the only thing she can focus on in this room, given her rest cure, right? And she's not supposed to be stimulated by any sort of meaningful work, or she can't write or talk to people, so she has this wallpaper that is she's using her imagination to make it sort of come to life in a bit. Then further down on page 79, again, it changes once more. She says, there are things in the paper that nobody knows about but me, or ever will. Behind the outside pattern, the dim shapes get clearer every day. It is always the same shape, only very numerous, and it is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind the paper. I don't like it a bit. I begin to think, I wish John would take me away from here. So it's no longer a formless sort of figure. Now it is a woman stooping down and creeping. So it becomes more and more the paper or the wallpaper seems more and more tied to her own self and a projection of her own feelings as she sort of determines that it's now a woman behind the paper. And then page 80, it escalates again. The faint figure behind seems to shake the pattern just as if she wanted to get out. So, and now it's not just a woman creeping behind the pattern, it's a woman shaking the pattern and imprisoned behind the sort of bars of the top pattern. So if this is a reflection of herself, she's feeling more and more isolated and imprisoned as John keeps her secluded in the upstairs room, and she feels that she is also trapped, just like the woman in the pattern. So there's indication again, this is reiterated on page 81, when she talks about the light changing by moonlight, it becomes more distinct. So nighttime, she's able to sort of look at the wallpaper in without John while he's sleeping. And it says, at night, in any kind of light, in twilight, candlelight, lamplight, and worst of all by moonlight, it becomes bars. The outside pattern, I mean, and the woman behind it is as plain as can be. I didn't realize for a long time that the thing that showed behind that dim sub-pattern, but now I am quite sure it is a woman. By daylight she is subdued, quiet. I fancy it is the pattern that keeps her so still. It's so puzzling. It keeps me quiet by the hour. So this realization that it's a woman behind bars, and she's has sort of two sides to herself, so she's very quiet and subdued during daylight and then comes to life in any sort of moonlight, especially where she shakes the pattern trying to get out from underneath the prison bars. And the moon itself is also a sort of traditionally feminine symbol. You think of women's moon time, those kind of associations. So the moonlight in the story, you could also read into that as being a symbol of the main character. And then there are other sort of interesting descriptions of the wallpaper that I don't really know what to make of, but you can, again, it's open to interpretation. There's lots of descriptions of kind of fungus-like toadstools being sort of represented in the pattern. The smell is an old, foul, bad yellow smell. So she talks about how the smell sort of clings to her and clings to the house itself. And there's also this big smooch, she says, where the wallpaper has been rubbed off. And it sounds as if, you know, there has been people who have lived in this room in the past who have also sort of been fascinated or horrified by this wallpaper and have tried to remove it. And then on 83 we have another evolution of this relationship with the wallpaper at the bottom. So the front pattern does move, and no wonder. The woman behind shakes it. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind and sometimes only one, and she crawls fast around and her crawling shakes it all over. And she is all the time trying to climb through, but nobody can climb through that pattern. So we have an indication that now there might be one woman, or there might be many women trapped behind this wallpaper. So we can sort of make a connection between this character, her situation, and how many women's lives were also sort of oppressed by similar circumstances at the time. So perhaps Gilman is sort of creating a commentary on the state of women's lives during the Victorian period and how they were also oppressed. And then there is this creeping activity, right? So the woman is always creeping, and she sometimes sees her at daylight, trying outside even, creeping, always creeping, trying not to get caught. And then she is acknowledging that she also partakes in this behavior. So 84, she says, "It is the same woman I know, for she is always creeping, and most women do not creep by daylight." And then further down, "I always lock the door when I creep by daylight. I don't want anybody to get that woman out at night but myself." So she also acknowledges creeping, right? So that sounds like behavior that's, I don't know, sneaky or underhanded, or you have to do it in private. It's something you don't want to get caught doing. So it sort of connects, the creeping sort of connects with the writing, I think, as well in the story, and how she has to sort of hide certain behaviors and not get caught doing things that she's not supposed to be doing. And then we have the indication she wants to be the one who lets this figure, this woman, this female figure, out of the wallpaper. So on page 85, our protagonist got up and ran to help her. I pulled and she shook, I shook and she pulled, and before morning we had peeled off yards of the paper. So she's trying to get this female vision, this projection of this female figure behind the wallpaper out of the wallpaper, and she does it by ripping and tearing at the wallpaper, and she's trying to do this before John comes home. And then she says, "I want to astonish John." So she's trying to free this woman, and she's going to astonish John. And then eventually, the very last scene of the book, John returns back to the home, and his wife has fully made a break, like she's completely out of touch with reality. And at this point, she and the woman behind the wallpaper are the same person. So on page 86 at the top, we get this description. She says, "I wonder if they all come out of the wallpaper as I did." So it's no longer two separate people. She is the person. She's the woman behind the wallpaper. And then she goes about creeping on the ground over and over repeatedly, making circles, crawling, creeping, sort of like an animal, or an infant even, how a child creeps or crawls on the ground. And then John comes home and discovers his wife, and then he's saying, "What is the matter?" he cried. "For God's sake, what are you doing?" And then she just keeps on creeping over him as he faints. So I kept on creeping just the same, and I looked at him over my shoulder. "I've got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back. Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time." So one of the mysteries of this story is some critics have said that this character Jane, who's just, her name is mentioned at the end there, possibly some have said that Jane is actually the name of our female protagonist this whole time. She's been nameless, and it's only at the end that she's sort of completely split herself off from reality. She's no longer Jane. Jane is the part of her that is conforming to gender norms, and then this other part of her is the woman who's freed from the wallpaper, from her life. So she's completely split herself down the middle and separated her identity in two. So she has finally, in this moment, astonished John. He faints, and she just keeps crawling over and over on top of him. So I linked to a dramatized version, a film version. PBS did a series on this story, where I've linked to the end scene, so you can watch it on the course homepage. And it gives the sense of how creepy the scene is, right? This is a gothic horror story, and it's again a dramatization of the mental breakdown of the main character, but it's also very much a sort of creepy scene. So that sort of reminds me of The Ring, or one of those horror movies where you have a character who sort of succumbs to an evil presence. but it's also